Was Jesus the Messiah of the Jews? Does Jesus fit the numerous prophecies in the Tanakh about the coming Messiah? I recently did a video as an introduction to what is going to be a months-long series trying to answer the question, was Jesus God? And in doing so, in my opinion, there are a number of prerequisites that we have to cover first before we can even begin to try to determine the answer to that question. The first prerequisite was the last video I uploaded, so if you want to watch that, I'll put that in a card above my head. But it was in regards to the titles of Jesus. What did the New Testament authors call him? What did they think he was? What were the descriptive terms used when trying to describe who Jesus was? I recommend watching that first and then watching this because they do feed off of each other in a certain sense. And then you can pay attention to the order of operations of the videos by paying attention to the thumbnails. There will be some kind of indication so you can keep track of the order. So getting into a couple of these first points, was Jesus the Messiah of the Jews? Now, obviously, many Jews don't believe so. Otherwise, they wouldn't have remained Jews, and we wouldn't still have a strong Jewish community today. Many Jews obviously did end up converting, including many of the extremely prominent Jewish characters in the Christian New Testament. One of the reasons we know that is because of Paul's epistles, as well as other New Testament texts. They have a heavy focus on the building of Jewish converts and Gentiles, the blending and building of one unified community in the Christian church early on. It would also be a mistake to ignore the very obvious fact that a number of Jesus's disciples were Jewish converts. So then the question is, are the Jewish converts wrong? Did they abandon their Jewish religion and culture in order to follow a false teacher or a con man? And in order to answer that question, we would first have to identify, well, what were the prophecies that some Jews believed were fulfilled and other Jews denied fulfillment of in regards to the character of Jesus Christ? So the first main point is on the screen. What were the main prophecies that the Jewish people were waiting for? And I've got a total of 5 and then some extras. So the first one of the dominant is the Messiah as a descendant of David. So 2 Samuel 7:12-13 says, God promises David that his throne will be established forever through his offspring. Jeremiah 23:5-6 says, the Messiah will be a righteous branch from David's line who will reign wisely and bring justice. And then Isaiah 9:6-7 says, a child will be born who will reign on David's throne, called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. The second one here, the Messiah as a suffering servant. This comes from Isaiah and Psalm. Isaiah 53 describes the suffering servant would be somebody who bears the sins of many, somebody to be despised, who is rejected, wounded for transgressions, but ultimately justify many. And then Psalm 22 contains vivid imagery of suffering, similar to the Isaiah, mockery, similar, and the casting of lots for clothing, which Christians connect to Jesus's crucifixion. The third one, the Messiah as a king and deliverer. So Zechariah 9:9 says, rejoice greatly, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey. Daniel 7:13-14 says, the Son of Man comes with the clouds of heaven and is given everlasting dominion and glory. And then Micah 5:2 foretells that the ruler of Israel will come from Bethlehem. The fourth, the Messiah's role in the new covenant. This is an important one. Jeremiah 31:31-34, where God promises a new covenant where his will be written on people's hearts. And we get a good bit of that in the New Testament for anybody who's familiar enough with it. Ezekiel 36:25-27 speaks of a time when God will cleanse his people, give them a new heart, and put his spirit within them. Again, these should be triggering responses in your brain if you are a somewhat educated Christian when it comes to the Bible. The fifth one, the Messiah's role in restoring Israel and then also the world. And there's some debate about some of these that we'll talk about later. Isaiah 11:1-10, a shoot from Jesse, David's father, will bring peace, justice, and knowledge of the Lord to the earth. Zechariah 12:10, the people will look on the one they have pierced and mourn for him. And then Malachi 3:1-4, a messenger will prepare the way before the Lord, and the Lord will come to his temple. And then these are the bonus ones. However, they will either include more context or more biblical backing. So a king from David's line. The Messiah would be a descendant of King David and restore his kingdom. More backing comes from 2 Samuel 7:12-16, as well as Jeremiah 23:5-6. A political and military leader. Many expected the Messiah to overthrow Roman rule and establish a sovereign Jewish state, with a bounce back to Isaiah 11:1-10. A restorer of the temple. Some believed he would cleanse and restore the temple of Jerusalem, and where that comes from is Malachi 3:1. A gatherer of Jewish exiles. The Messiah would regather all Jews back to the land of Israel. That comes from Isaiah 11:12. A bringer of world peace and justice. He would end war and establish a reign of peace. Isaiah 2:2-4 and Micah 4:3. And then a teacher of the law, or the Torah. He would lead people in righteousness and obedience to God's law. And that's both from Deuteronomy 18:18 or Isaiah 42:1-4. So then why did many Jews reject Jesus? Going through the above sections, if you're biblically literate, there were probably some you were like, that fits, that makes sense. I see why Jesus is the guy. And if you're biblically literate, I'm sure there were some where you were thinking, I don't know if those things quite came true. So why did many Jews reject Jesus? He didn't overthrow Roman rule. Instead, he preached love for enemies and submission to authorities, and sometimes in direct context with Roman rule. Matthew 5:44 and Mark 12:17 are good examples of this. He was crucified. So according to Deuteronomy 21:23, being hanged on a tree was considered a curse. I feel like most people know this because this is often used by atheists when in debate as well. This led many to doubt his messianic identity. The world did not enter into an era of peace. War, suffering, and Roman oppression continued, and we could stretch that throughout history now. That has never happened. We have never had that. Many Christians have an answer to this that we'll talk about in a little bit. He reinterpreted the law. This is a pretty big one. Many Jewish leaders saw Jesus' teachings as radical, such as his stance on the Sabbath, out of Matthew 12:1-8. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD instead of being restored. The temple was destroyed by the Romans, which seemed to contradict the prophecies of the Messiah's reign. To be fair then, why did so many Jews convert to Christianity? Some of the prophecies that Christians believe were answered, and obviously many Jews believed were answered, were as follows. The Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. So the prophecy comes from Micah 5:2, and the fulfillment of comes from Matthew and Luke, Jesus being born in Bethlehem. The Messiah would be a descendant of David. The prophecy comes from Jeremiah 23:5, and the fulfillment comes from two of the Gospels, as well as Romans 1:3. Messiah would be a descendant of David. The prophecy comes from Jeremiah 23:5, and the fulfillment of comes from two of the Gospels, as well as Romans 1:3. Jesus being called Son of David, and the tracing of his lineage back to David. The Messiah would be born of a virgin, out of Isaiah 7:14, prophecy-wise, and the answer of the prophecy comes from Matthew and Luke. Mary, who we believe to be a virgin, gave birth to Jesus. The Messiah would enter Jerusalem on a donkey. The prophecy, Zechariah 9:9, and the fulfillment, both Matthew and John, when Jesus enters Jerusalem on a donkey, and the people hailed him as king. The Messiah would be rejoiced by his own people. Isaiah 53:3 is the prophecy. The fulfillment of comes from John in two places, as well as Luke, where Jesus was rejected by many of the Jewish leaders, as well as the people. The Messiah would be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. Zechariah 11:12-13 was the prophecy, and the fulfillment of we get in Matthew 26 and Matthew 27, when Judas Iscariot betrays Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, which was later used to buy a potter's field, or the field of blood. The Messiah would be silent before his accusers. The prophecy comes from Isaiah 53:7. The answer too comes from Matthew as well as Mark, when Jesus remained silent before Pilate as well as his accusers. The Messiah would be pierced. Zechariah 12:10, fulfillment being in John, and then Revelation as well, technically. Jesus was crucified, and his side was pierced by a Roman soldier. The Messiah would die as sacrifice for sin. Isaiah 53, 5-6. And then the fulfillment out of Romans, 1 Peter, and 1 Corinthians, where it is expressed that Jesus' death was understood to be atonement for sin. The Messiah would be buried in a rich man's tomb. Isaiah 53:9 is where it comes from. The fulfillment is thought to be found in Matthew 27, when we get that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph, who happened to be a wealthy man. The Messiah would rise from the dead. Prophecy comes from Psalm 16, fulfillment in Matthew, Acts, and 1 Corinthians, where Jesus rose from the dead on the third day. The Messiah would ascend into heaven. Comes from Psalm 68, fulfillment in Luke and Acts. Jesus ascends into heaven before his disciples. And finally, the Messiah would establish a new covenant. Comes from Jeremiah 31, fulfillment in Luke 22 and Hebrews 9, where Jesus introduces the new covenant through his death and resurrection. Were any prophecies not fulfilled? That is the obvious on the way out question that needs to be addressed. I have 3 examples, but there is an argument for more. The Messiah will reign as king over all nations, out of Isaiah. The wolf will lie with the lamb, also out of Isaiah. All nations will worship the one true God, out of Zechariah. In my experience, most Christians will then assert that this will be fulfilled at the time of the second coming. With those, there are a few I want to backtrack to very quickly, because there are a few of the fulfillments that there is quite a bit of academic disgruntlement over. So I'd like to just point that out, and I'm not going to go into depth on any of them. The Messiah being a descendant of David, that prophecy. And then our understanding is that Jesus was a descendant of David. I just want you to know that there, within the academic world, there is argument about this. There is argument about the actual genealogy reports that we have of Jesus. There's argument about if they were added later, things like that. So there's a potential possibility, a non-zero chance that perhaps Jesus was not a descendant of David. The Messiah being born of a virgin. This comes from Isaiah. There are 2 parts to this in terms of potential problems. Part 1 is that the virgin birth of a deity was not a Christian thing. And there's a lot of reasons to believe some of these stories predated Christianity. That on its own does not make it's not true, but it's just something to look into and to be aware of. The other side of it is that there's a potential translation issue between the Gospels being in Greek and Isaiah being written in Hebrew. I would go watch a video I did recently about the virgin birth. It was about a month ago, where I went over that potential translation issue and then come to a conclusion on your own. As with everything else, I hope you take the time to look into these things yourself and come to your own conclusions. But this was just the next logical step in the journey to trying to decide, was Jesus God? Is that true? Knowing what we know, having the data and the information that we have, how much can we really dig into this and see where this idea came from and how much it's validated in Christian history? Outside of that, we have another YouTube channel. It's at Live Bible Study. We do 3 live streams every week. We're reading the Gospel of Thomas right now, the Book of Giants, as well as the Book of Job. So follow along with those. They're very good. They're very in-depth. And then every week on Tuesday, we do a topic discussion on this YouTube channel. We did Purgatory recently, Reincarnation, the historicity of the Gospels, Marcion in the First New Testament, Gnosticism, Christian mental health. We talk about anything because those topics for Tuesday come from Discord, where every week we run a poll. Whatever wins the poll is what we talk about. Join Discord too. There's a link in the description of the video. It's free. It will always be free. It is just a bunch of people who are into the stuff that we talked about today. This kind of thing, Christian history, deeper thinking, not just accepting whatever you were taught in church. So if that is you, I think you'd probably get along with our beautiful little family of 200 something people. Love y'all. Have a great day.